Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Bernstein, Chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council.
Good morning. As the procession of the Liberating Division flags begins, we think about the extraordinary sacrifice of our soldiers who defeated Nazism. It is worth recalling that even while they were embroiled in combat, well before the magnitude of the extermination of the Jews was fully revealed, discussions began among the Allies about post-war justice. With foresight and temperance, the victorious powers resisted vengeance in favor of the law. A new legal precedent, they hoped, would extinguish the possibility of the world ever facing these crimes again. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg codified a new law to protect civilians, crimes against humanity, and it prosecuted Nazi war criminals for atrocities they committed not only against their own citizens, but those of other nations. It rejected the long-standing doctrine of sovereign immunity, which exempted heads of state from prosecution. And it rejected the doctrine which protected subordinates for being prosecuted for crimes they committed under orders. Among the men working with the prosecution team to prepare for the Nuremberg trials was Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish lawyer who had fled to the United States. Lemkin had dedicated his life to creating legal protections for ethnic, national, and religious groups. And in 1941, he had introduced the word genocide to give name to the systematic murder of targeted groups. Lemkin managed to get the word genocide included in the indictment against Nazi leadership, but the trial at Nuremberg failed to define it as a specific crime in international law. After the war, Lemkin learned that 49 members of his family, including his parents, had been killed in the Holocaust. Horrified and driven, he worked tirelessly to have the newly formed United Nations adopt the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Relying on the standards set by Nuremberg, the Convention created a framework in which nations could hold one another responsible for crimes against civilian groups. But the decades that followed were marked by tragic disregard for mass atrocities. It was not until the 1990s that, having failed to stop devastating violence in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the international community held the first international tribunals since Nuremberg. Later, the International Criminal Court was established as the first permanent judicial body to try individuals for the crime of genocide. And in 2005, the UN adopted the doctrine of responsibility to protect, which affirmed the fundamental idea of Nuremberg. Guided by Nuremberg, our efforts to prosecute perpetrators of these enormous crimes have certainly progressed. But the most meaningful legacy of Nuremberg will come when our actions today invalidate the need for trials tomorrow, and our ability to prevent genocide becomes real. So as the U.S. Army flags enter the rotunda, we recall not only our brave soldiers and their legacy of freedom, but also the 462 post-World War II American military trials and their legacy of justice, a legacy we need to fully honor. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of the flags of the United States Army Liberating Units, followed by the national colors. First Infantry Division, Falkenau an der Eger, and 101st Airborne Division, Landsberg. 2nd Infantry Division, Leipzig-Schönefeld and Spergau, and 82nd Airborne Division, Verblin. 4th Infantry Division, Dachau Subcamps, and 20th Armored Division, Dachau. 8th Infantry Division, Verblin, and 14th Armored Division, Dachau Subcamps. 26th Infantry Division, Gusen, and 12th Armored Division, Landsberg. 29th Infantry Division, Dinslaken, and 11th Armored Division, Gusen and Mauthausen. 36th Infantry Division, Kaufering Camps, and 10th Armored Division, Landsberg. 42nd Infantry Division, Dachau, and 9th Armored Division, Falkenau an der Eger. 45th Infantry Division, Dachau, and 8th Armored Division, Halberstadt-Zwieberge. 63rd Infantry Division, Kaufering Camps, and 6th Armored Division, Buchenwald. 65th Infantry Division, Flossenburg Subcamp, and 4th Armored Division, Ohrdruf. 69th Infantry Division, Leipzig-Thekla, and 3rd Armored Division, Dora-Mittelbau. 71st Infantry Division, Gunskirchen, and 104th Infantry Division, Dora-Mittelbau. 80th Infantry Division, Buchenwald and Ebensee, and 103rd Infantry Division, Landsberg. 83rd Infantry Division, Langenstein, and 99th Infantry Division, Dachau Subcamps. 84th Infantry Division, Allem and Salzwedel, and 95th Infantry Division, Werl. 86th Infantry Division, Attendorn, and 90th Infantry Division, Flossenburg. 89th Infantry Division, Ohrdruf. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the presentation of the national colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Michael Oren of the State of Israel.
Thank you. To my friend and source of inspiration since I was a teenager, to Elie Wiesel, to my other esteemed speakers this morning, Justice Breyer, distinguished members of Congress, and honorable representatives of the administration, Holocaust survivors and liberators, and our dear friends from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. 66 years ago this month, the war in Europe ended. My father, then serving as a corporal in the combat engineer company that had landed on Normandy Beach and fought its way through the Battle of the Bulge, remembers looking up at a squadron of Allied bombers flying overhead and releasing tens of thousands of leaflets over recently liberated territory. Nazis quit. That's what the leaflet said. And my father still has that leaflet laminated, hanging on the wall in his home. The world was celebrating. People were dancing in the street, but the Jewish people could not partake in those festivities. A third of them were dead. 6 million of them had been shot and gassed and starved, and the few 100,000 survivors had been rendered homeless, still confined behind barbed wire in displaced persons camps. The great majority of them did not want to remain in the countries that had collaborated either actively or passively with the effort to destroy them. Many wanted to return to their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. But that route too was denied to them. And many who tried to escape were forced back to the scenes of their recent torment. The world rejoiced, and we, the Jews, we lamented. The world looked toward a happier future, and we remembered an agonizing past. Today, VE Day, passes almost unnoticed here in the United States, but Holocaust Remembrance Day is widely and profoundly marked. The memory of the suffering of millions, it seems, outlasts the fleeting joys of victory. We remember the GIs, some of whom honor us with their presence today, who liberated the death camps. We salute their valor and pay homage to their humanity as they nurtured the starving and comforted those who were too sick to survive. We remember the American volunteers who worked in those displacement camps and who, at great risk, enabled some of those refugees to reach Israel. So too, we remember you, the survivors, who found refuge in the United States, who rebuilt their lives and rebuilt their families, and who in turn immeasurably enriched America. And we remember the American people, who, under the leadership of President Harry Truman, made the United States the first nation on earth to recognize the reborn Jewish state. We remember all that was done, yes, but just as crucially, we must remember what was not done. We must remember the refugee-laden ships turned away from countless shores, including the shores of this country, and consigned to the slaughterhouses of Europe. We must remember those same Allied bombers that bombed targets near Auschwitz, but refrained from striking the camp itself or from striking the railways that fed that camp. We must remember the world that remained silent while Jews were imprisoned in Nazi-occupied Europe and the gates of the land of Israel were locked. We are obligated to remember, painful though it is, because the hatred that bred the Holocaust still persists. We know that the Nazi plan to destroy us as a people was preceded by a campaign to deny the humanity of the Jewish people. And today we witness efforts to deny the legitimacy of the Jewish state. In Lebanon, Hezbollah glorifies the mass murder of Jews and aims 50,000 rockets at our homes. Hamas, meanwhile, in Gaza, firing on our towns on school buses, and proclaims its goal of annihilating the Jews not just in Israel, but annihilating the Jews worldwide. And Iran, the backer of Hezbollah and Hamas, denies the Holocaust while swearing to wipe Israel off the map, to perpetrate another Holocaust, while developing the nuclear means for doing just that. We need to remember, but we must also need to learn. We must acknowledge the genuine presence of evil in the world and the persistence of genocidal hatred. We need to realize that evil is not defeated by goodness alone, but by goodness galvanized by action. Merely saying never again will not suffice. Never again means shunning all passivity and blindness. Today, thank God, there is a Jewish state capable of defending itself and preserving our people's future. Today, thank God, that Jewish state is allied with the greatest and most powerful nation on earth. But we must never forget a time when the state of Israel did not exist, when the Jews had neither shelters nor defenders. We must remember the few who were saved and the millions who were not, those who rose heroically and those who turned away. We must remember that hatred remains a scourge in our world today, and that it is our responsibility, it is our duty to defeat it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah Bloomfield, Director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
A few blocks from here, engraved on the walls of the Justice Department, is this important reminder. Justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first resides in the hearts and souls of its citizens. Today, as we contemplate the meaning of justice, it is worth recalling that one of the first things the Nazis did was to redefine the nature of citizenship, excluding Jews and others from the protection of the law. And they did this through the law. In fact, in spite of their revolutionary and violent nature, the Nazis often used the law rather than skirt it. And judges, who were highly respected in society, were among those inside Germany who could have effectively challenged the regime and its hundreds of laws that restricted basic rights and freedoms. And yet, the overwhelming majority of judges did not. For 12 long years, hearing countless cases, most interpreted the law in ways that facilitated the Nazis' agenda. Their role was so instrumental that after the war, Nuremberg prosecutor Telford Taylor, in commenting on the judge's trial, said this: "The dagger of the assassin was concealed beneath the robe of the jurist." Now, when we think about the power these judges had and the enormous consequences of their decisions, it is striking to compare their actions to those who were seemingly powerless. People like Otto and Elise Hampel, a simple working-class couple in Nazi Berlin. Elise was a domestic with only an elementary school education. Otto was a factory worker known for his reticence. They had no history of political activity. And yet, in 1940, they decided to resist Nazism by secretly dropping postcards all over Berlin, calling for civil disobedience and workplace sabotage. Because the Hampels were poorly educated, the postcards were written in terrible handwriting, with many misspellings and grammatical errors. Otto had to write all the postcards because Elise could not print well. These postcards said things like, "German people wake up," or "Hitler's regime will bring us no peace." Another said, "Hitler's war is the workers' death." Germans who found them turned them into the police, but the Hampels persisted. For almost 3 years, they dropped hundreds of these postcards throughout Berlin. An angry and confused Gestapo were convinced they were dealing with a large, sophisticated, well-organized resistance movement. But it was just one ordinary couple. In 1943, the Hampels were caught and beheaded. And there's one more thing to say about the fate of the Hampels. Before they were executed, they were put on trial in accordance with the law. Such was Nazi justice. So today, as we reflect on the nature of true justice, we acknowledge our responsibility to do justice to the memory of millions of innocent men, women, and children. And let us also remember and be inspired by those like the Hampels who paid with their life as they struggled to create a more just world.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elie Wiesel, founding chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council.
Among us, Hitler's many victims, we rarely commemorate the law. It too was imprisoned, perverted, ridiculed, disfigured, and even outlawed, not only by the regime, but also by those who was supposed to uphold and defend it. The entire judicial community swore allegiance to the Führer. No judge dared to look at innocent prisoners with fairness and empathy. If attacked by an enemy, the Jew could not go to the police, for the police was the enemy. Nor were the courts there to offer help. And so the victims felt not only abandoned, but repudiated and shamed. Few citizens in Germany opened the door to the fugitive. What these judges were missing was a sense of fairness, an individual conscience, personal courage, and moral integrity. In those days, human compassion was out of fashion. Today, in our cherished country, there is a remarkable, blessed man, a man with many, many judges like him, and that man, Justice Breyer, stands out. His words are certain to leave an imprint on history. He loves literature, history, and philosophy. He speaks several languages, but his true passion is the law. It is the law that defines the intensity and greatness of a civilization. The Constitution is to him what the biblical commandments were to the kings of Judea. He transcended their political power. What matters to Justice Breyer is his ability to appeal to the nobility of all of us. The French writer André Malraux wrote, in ancient times, the Jewish people alone took God's words seriously. And now we may say that Justice Breyer lends to the words of the Constitution and the law the strength, the spirituality of morality, the epitome of humanity's noble aspirations. Thus, it is with enormous admiration that I have the honor to invite my illustrious friend, Justice Stephen Breyer, to guide us through the painful universe of remembrance.
Thank you, Eli Wiesel. That's such a great honor and so personally touching. We're here today, and we gather to remember the Holocaust. I come here as a judge and a Jew to participate in this annual ceremony, mandated by law, to speak about the law in the task of recollection. As the Nazi atrocities fall further into the past, direct recollection may become more difficult, but it will not become less important. The book of Exodus frightens me and it frightens us when it says about a king, perhaps about an entirely new generation, that it grew up and it knew not Joseph. The French writer Albert Camus elaborates the same thought in a book that I find speaks to me, personally touching, The Plague, an allegory of the Nazi occupation of France. His hero, Dr. Rieux, explains why he has written the story down. It is because, he says, the bacillus de la peste, that's the plague germ, a symbol for the evil in human nature, it is because that germ never dies. It never entirely disappears. It simply goes into remission, perhaps for decades, but all the while it lurks in the furniture, in the linen cupboards, in the bedrooms, in the cellars, in trunks, in handkerchiefs, in file folders, perhaps one day to re-emerge, to reawaken its rats, and then to the misfortune and for the education of mankind to send them forth once again to die in a once happy city. What role can the law play in helping us, through recollection, guard against that day when that perpetual evil, analogous to the plague germ, might reawaken? Let us consider three different kinds of answers to that question that the law can provide. Now, first, those who work with the law can engage in certain classical, mundane legal tasks, like gathering and preserving evidence and creating legal precedent. When I was honored to appear here several years ago, I spoke of a man who engaged in just those tasks, Justice Robert Jackson, once a member of the court on which I sit. 65 years ago, Jackson put aside his work in Washington in order to serve as the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. He later described his Nuremberg work as the most important experience of my life, infinitely more important, he said, than my work on the Supreme Court or anything I did as Attorney General. His object, he said, was to make explicit and unambiguous in law that to persecute, oppress, or do violence to individuals or minorities on political, racial, or religious grounds is an international crime for the commission of which individuals are responsible and can and will be punished. He began by telling the Nuremberg Tribunal that, and I love these words, the wrongs we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. And then he built what he called a drab case. He did not try, he said, to appeal to the press or to the public. He understood his role as collecting hard evidence largely built on the Nazis' own documents, the authenticity of which, he said, could not be challenged, and it was not challenged. The 19 defendants could not answer that evidence because there was nothing to say. Jackson collected the evidence not simply to convict the war criminals, but also to document the facts for history to remember. We must establish incredible events, he said, by credible evidence, and that evidence must be presented with such authenticity and in such detail that there can be no responsible denial of these crimes in the future, and no tradition of martyrdom of the Nazi leaders can arise among informed people. So he and the other prosecutors brought to Nuremberg 100,000 captured German documents. They examined millions of feet of captured film. They produced 25,000 still photographs together with Hitler's personal photographer, who took most of them. And month after month, in over 17,000 transcript pages, they assembled a mountain of evidence to which no response was possible. History was there revealed. It remains revealed for all the future to see. Now, second, another thing law can do is that those who work with law can, through trials that tell stories, help produce an emotional as well as a factual understanding of just what occurred. Doing so was in significant part the object of another trial which took place 50 years ago in Jerusalem. It was the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the man in charge of transporting millions of Jews to death camps. In prosecuting the case against Eichmann, Israel's Attorney General Gideon Hausner provided documentation, but he did something more. He sought out survivors of the Holocaust to bear witness. About 100 took the stand. They told their own stories about what they saw, about what they endured, about what they survived, and about how they remembered those who did not survive. The audience was different from that of Nuremberg. The trial was televised, both in Israel and around the world. Millions in the United States watched the proceedings. And for the first time, many people heard the Holocaust survivors tell their stories with their own voices. Hannah Arendt described, as we know, how the trial did not just tell us, but it showed us what she called the banality of evil. Historian Deborah Lipstadt tells us that those human stories, the stories of those involved, changed our perception of the victims of genocide. Seen from the perspective of today's topic, which is remembrance, both trials had an important role to play. We remember through facts, figures, rational argument. We also remember through human stories that carry emotion and impact feeling. The documented record prevents history from doubting what was done. The compelling personal stories help prevent the future from forgetting the victims themselves, their stories, and their humanity. Now, there is a third way that law can help. For today, throughout the world, many are at work at another important practical task: building institutions that use law to protect us against law's antithesis, the exercise of arbitrary power. Since the end of World War II, ever more nations have adopted democratic forms of government that, like our own, guarantee basic individual rights, in part through constitutions that an independent judiciary seeks to enforce. At the same time, the example of Nuremberg has helped to inspire the establishment of tribunals, often international tribunals, with authority to protect basic human rights and to pursue those who violate them. Consider the European Court of Human Rights, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the Tribunal for Rwanda, the International Criminal Court. The lessons of the Eichmann trial also may have influenced other efforts to prevent us from forgetting past violations, as when South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through public exposure, helped to inform the world about the human rights violations of the apartheid era. In these and in related ways, we have seen nations seek gradually to expand a rule of law designed to protect us against the re-emergence of Camus' germ of the plague. Unfortunately, however, we need only look around today's world to understand that rights, rules, the obligations that the law sets forth, all of them are no more powerful than the human will to enforce them. Thus, the work of developing an enforceable rule of law proceeds very slowly. Its product is imperfect, and like the tapestry of Penelope, the legal cloth that we weave during the day is unraveled during the night. But that is simply all the more reason to remember to continue the work, to substitute, as Justice Jackson reminded us, the power of reason for the force of power. The Talmud teaches us it is not incumbent upon you to complete the work, but neither are you free to evade it. Despite the terrible examples of the Holocaust Museum contains, I find its final room a room that's filled with silence, for what is there to say? But also filled with light. I find in that final room a symbol of hope. Nuremberg can remind us that the Holocaust story ended with a fair trial. And that trial, along with other ways in which law can further the work of remembrance, also reminds us of our eternal aspiration for justice. Aeschylus wrote about that aspiration 2,500 years ago in the Eumenides, when justice, overcoming the avenging furies, promises Athens that her seat, the seat of justice, shall be a wall, a bulwark of salvation, wide as your land, as your imperial state, none mightier in the habitable world. We too reflect upon that aspiration when we say, with the psalmist, justice and law are the foundations of your throne.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joshua Bolton, Vice Chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council.
Today we mark the 50th anniversary of a pivotal moment in the history of Holocaust remembrance. Not merely the Eichmann trial, but the searing testimony there of 100 survivors whose words, whose memories echo across the ages from that courtroom a half-century ago to this hallowed space today. Deborah Lipstadt recounts that story in her new book, The Eichmann Trial. Presenting the survivors' testimony was not an obvious decision at the time. Some felt that the testimony would be prejudicial or unnecessary. But prosecutor Gideon Hausner understood its extraordinary power. In his opening statement, he said, "As I stand before you, I do not stand alone. With me in this place and at this hour stand 6 million accusers. But they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards the man in the glass dock and cry, 'J'accuse.' Their blood cries out, but their voices are not heard." So Hausner ensured that many voices would be heard. One French survivor told of comforting Jewish children whose parents had been deported. Often crying out in the night for their parents, all they wanted to know was when would they see them again. He tried to reassure them, knowing this was not to be. A Hungarian woman brought to the trial a letter from her husband. He had thrown it from a train, having written on it, "Blessed be the hand which posts this letter." The letter read, "My dear wife and children, I shall bear my fate whatever it may be. I do not want to make you sad, but I would want very much to live in your midst. May God grant that we may be allowed to achieve that." His wish would not be granted. Another recalled seeing his wife and daughter disappear into a massive crowd at Birkenau, recognizing them by his daughter's bright red coat, which got smaller and smaller and then disappeared forever. Unlike the Eichmann trial, the Nuremberg trials, as just now so thoughtfully and beautifully described by Justice Breyer, were based largely on reams of German documents, not eyewitnesses. 15 years later, when many survivors would take the witness stand in front of Eichmann, they did not speak of bureaucratic statistics, official memoranda, or train schedules. They spoke about lives and deaths. Not of faceless statistics, but of individual souls. Today, by lighting these candles, so do we. Assisting us in our candle lighting will be Manal El-Haq, a member of the inaugural class of the Stephen Tyrone Johns Summer Youth Leadership Program, which was established by the museum in memory of Officer Johns, who died heroically in 2009 while protecting museum visitors and staff. The first candle will be lit by Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi and Charles Stein, a museum volunteer who fled Austria after the Nazi takeover. The second candle will be lit by Henry Waxman of California and Munir Sarna, who survived a forced labor camp in Czechoslovakia. The third candle will be lit by Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois and Nellie Wiesenthal Fink a museum volunteer who fled Nazi Germany just before Kristallnacht. The fourth candle will be lit by Senator Susan Collins of Maine and Simon Braitman, who survived a subcamp of Auschwitz. The fifth candle will be lit by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida and Helen Sternlight Jonas, a survivor of a forced labor camp in Poland. The sixth and final candle will be lit by Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut and William Lowe, a survivor of Auschwitz.
Ladies and gentlemen, El Molerachamim, Memorial Prayer for the Dead, will be chanted by cantor Josh Perlman. Israel Arbeiter, a survivor of the Holocaust from Poland, will then lead us in recitation of the Kaddish. Please rise.
שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את כל הנשמות של 6 מיליוני היהודים, חללי השואה באירופה, שנהרגו, שנסחטו, שנשרפו ושנספו על קידוש השם בידי המרצחים הגרמנים ויוזריהם משאר העמים. באוישוויץ, טרבלינקה, Majdanek, Mauthausen, Bergen Belsen, Sobibor, Uveshar Machanos Hashmada, Shehalechu Yolamam, Uvaur Shekol HaKahal Mitpalel Ilui Nishmoteihem, Lachein Baal HaRachamim, Oy Rachamim, Yastirein B'Seiter Kenafav Le'yolamim, V'yitzror b'yitzror HaChaim et nishmotayim. Adonai hu nachlatam, Began Eden tehei menuchatam. Yamdu legorolam leketz hayamin, v'nomar Amen.
Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabo, be'olmo devro chirusei, yamlich malchusei, b'chayachom, uv'chayei dechol beis Yisrael, begalo uv'zman korev, v'yimru omen. Yehei shmei rabo mevorach, la'olam olmei olmayo. Yisborach v'yishtabach, v'yispoar v'yisroman, V'yisnasei, v'yisador, v'yisalei, v'yishalo, shmei d'kedushu brichu. Le'elo min kol, brichoso, v'shirichoso, tushbechoso, v'nemechoso, damiron bilmo v'imru omen. Yehei shlomo rabo min shamayim, haim oleinu v'al kol Yisroel v'imru omen. Oseh shalom b'imromo, v'yaseh shalom oleinu, V'al kol Yisroel v'imru Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the singing of the partisan hymn led by Cantor Perlman.
Niet geen mal als de geest hem letzten weg, kost himlen blijne forschen bij je tijd. Kom in wet nog unser ausgebeckte Schor, Svet abheugt und unser Trott mit seinen Droh. Kom in wet noch unser ausgebeckte Schor, Svet abheugt und unser Trott mit seiner Droh. In Palmen Land bis Wasserland und Schee. Wir kommen mit unser Pan, mit unser Wein. Und gewalmens las beschmutzen unser Blut. Sprotzen Worte unser Gruber, unser Mut. Over gewalmens ist so Sputz für unser Blut. Sprotzen Worte unser Gruber, unser Mut. Zolt nicht einmal las Gottes dem letzten Weg. Post Himmeln bleine verstellen bleuen Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebenkte Schor. Es wird abheugt und unser Treut mit seinen Ohr. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebenkte Schor. Es wird abheugt und unser Treut min seinen Tod.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated while the Liberating Division flags are retired. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's program. Thank you for sharing in our commitment to Holocaust remembrance.